Welcome to another episode of Love Selling, Hate Sales. Since 2014, I've been selling marketing to marketers, which is a really interesting concept. You're selling someone's own profession to them. But the one thing that I've noticed throughout that time is that marketing tends to speak a different language than the rest of the C-suite. Everyone, the CFO, the CEO, they all have their spreadsheets, their ledgers, the way they build their financial models, how they track and measure success. But then marketing tends to do it a little bit differently. And I think that becomes a challenge when marketing leaders get put in the seat and they have to go and answer to the board. And so often we see this concept of just show me the leads, right? Marketing gets boiled down to this one thing, this magical lead, because it's tangible to the rest of the C-suite. But oftentimes that indicator is not really a good indicator of success for marketing. So today for the show, I'm joined by my friend, Mark Goblirsch, who is a managing director with Shift Paradigm. Mark, I want to thank you for joining the show, and I'm excited to jump in on this topic.
Josh, thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here and excited to dive in and talk a little more about it. We have an interesting topic today.
Yeah. So when we were wrapping a little bit pre-show, we talked about the pressures that marketers are under. And I do think of that pressure coming down from that umbrella that I talked about a little bit around just speaking a different language than the rest of the C-suite. How do you see it?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things kind of mixed into that. I think not only do they speak a little bit of a different language and they're thinking about different metrics and objectives, they're also encumbered, I believe, by organizational beliefs. And I think that's making the job of a marketer, especially the chief marketer these days, very, very difficult. It's risky. Sometimes I joke around about it being a little bit, like Survivor. You don't want to get voted off the island. You end up in this kind of survival mode while you're going through. And even if you're crushing it, you tend to, in that role, you tend to feel the pressure. You feel the stress. Now, I think where some of that stress and pressure can kind of come to life and come to the forefront in the relationships within the firms, especially the ones that we work with and across the board, are in those communications, right? And sometimes folks can end up feeling like they're on a different page. When oftentimes they are on the same page, they might be using different nomenclatures, or their business plans aren't quite aligned. But communication and how they think about the business, how they talk about it, and what those key metrics are, I think are really important to achieve that alignment and maintain it throughout.
You mentioned organizational beliefs. Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, that's organizational beliefs that's my blanket term that I use for things such as, oftentimes you'll see somebody says, hey, when X happens, we get an outcome of Y. And when you start to ask, describe that to me. How do we know that? What's the situation there? What are the facts or information or data that back that up? You oftentimes will find that that's maybe a study of one, a sample of one. And so you go, well, is that real? Or is that simply an organizational belief, right? The other thing that happens out there, and beyond that kind of like sample of one, that study of one, I've found over and over again in my career from a marketing perspective, oftentimes what's made a company very, very successful in the past actually becomes their Achilles heel. Especially we saw that through all the digital transformation that's been occurring for years now and continues to occur. And so some of those organizational beliefs that when you hear them, the sound bites are like, they sound a lot like, we don't do it that way, or that's not what makes us successful. That's not how we do things. We know that doesn't work. And when you start to dig into those statements and ask questions around them, you can often find that they come down to sort of dogma or organizational belief, and sometimes aren't rooted in fact. And that can really hold an organization back.
Where do you think that pressure comes from? Is it coming from the CEO who doesn't necessarily understand marketing? Is it sales who believes marketing should be one thing versus another? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think when we started off the conversation, Josh, you brought up this idea of communication, and are folks on the same page? I think a lot of it comes down to communication and planning together and in transparency along the way. More and more, especially through the pandemic, everybody went virtual, on camera all day. Some of us were on camera 10, 11, 12 hours a day for a long time there, right? And so you're sort of running, you're sprinting all day. And when everybody's running fast, that brings me back to childhood. When I think about the pace we're going, I think about remember there were all those kids that kid can run really fast and that kid's kind of slow.
That was you.
Right. But, but when you're kids, you didn't run fast all the time. Right. It was more of a marathon and you'd sprint bits and pieces, maybe playing kick the can, you're running fast, but, or hide and go seek, but you're hiding a little bit too, and you're resting and relaxing. And these days we're all running fast all the time. When that happens, I think we get sort of this like perfect storm of us trying to sort of manage ourselves and be proactive and have that feeling, that emotional feeling of being in control of our world and our life and where we're going. But then we also we're struggling to touch base with and align with and communicate with our peers around us. And that adds to this feeling of not being in control, right? When your peers that you need to work hand in hand with are going and doing things, perhaps making decisions. And even if it's the right decision, and sometimes you don't know about it or you find out about it after the fact. And so there becomes this sort of fracture, between organizations. And I think that there are a number of ways you could probably solve this challenge. But I do think a lot of it comes down to communication and just the pace at which we're working today. And it's hard to find the time to maintain alignment, which is so, so important,
Yeah. So I think that's a really good segue, because now you've set the stage for basically the climate for what the marketing leader is dealing with. Right. And now you started to turn that a little bit into the market shift and the market change, things that are happening. So this is a sales podcast, right? So essentially we need to talk a little bit about how does that impact the seller? The CMO is a massive target for sales outreach for those people out there. What are there? Some 10,000 marketing technologies in the landscape. There's companies like us that are consultancies. There's agencies. There's all these different types of things that all want the CMO's attention. How then do you cut through that pace, that pressure, and now the massive shift in market conditions where not everything's all rainbows and unicorns?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is, to try to determine, even if it's by proxy or from afar, is what kind of a marketer is that CMO? And there are these kind of three broad buckets, I'll call it, of marketers. Generally, you typically have your qualitative marketers, the ones that are more interested in things like research and what's going on out in the marketplace, or creatives, right? People that can create awesome designs that are really visually appealing and aesthetic and great copy that's intriguing and clever and witty. And then on the other end of that spectrum, you tend to have really quant marketers that are really interested in data. They're really interested in measurement, very interested in things like analytics and helping to create analytics that drive and enhance customer interaction at points along the journey, right? But then you have these unique marketers, and these are the rare ones, and these are the ones that folks should look for out there, right? But they're the ones that can kind of have a foot in both of those worlds. Their brain is somewhat equally divided, maybe not exactly equal, but somewhat. Those marketers tend to be, in my opinion, the most valuable. They're the most strategic. They also understand how to create project plans. They understand what it's like, and how to kind of drive that day in and day out sort of creative and campaigning process that's a drumbeat that never ends, right? So it's very, very different kind of work to go from strategy to tactics. Those that can do both are really interesting people. Now, that said, all three of those types can make it into that C-suite position. It really kind of depends on the organization and the culture, right? It doesn't matter which one of those you are. There's a high likelihood today that person feels like their world is super chaotic. There's a high likelihood that they feel pretty overwhelmed. There's a high likelihood that they're making decisions as a result or forming opinions and kind of locking those opinions in and throwing away the key. And that's human nature, right? That helps them alleviate cognitive burden, helps them kind of free up some brain space and brain time and cycles to go and focus on the things that are right in front of them within their chaotic environment. So I think, like, depending on what we're trying to sell to that person or to that person's organization, understanding kind of the macro level pressures that they're under and where they're coming from and how those can emotionally feel like chaos for that person and can be anxiety producers, can kind of keep them up at night. But then also understanding, hey, if we're selling, let's say we're selling a customer analytics software platform, if I make that up, but if we can determine that chief officer sitting in that role came up through the creative circles and is really, it's really not the kind of buyer that we're looking to talk to, it probably won't resonate with that person. Even if it, like, maybe you get to the CEO and maybe the CEO is very interested in that, but there might almost be like a skip level between the CEO and maybe some kind of a senior director or a vice president or what have you, that really has that in their remit to go and be more quantitative in terms of how they approach their customers.
That's a really good example, because you think about your A, B, and C, right? The qualitative marketer, the quantitative marketer, and then the rare breed who's a hybrid of both. Marketing has become such a multidisciplinary header. You see everything from technologists to data analysts to copywriters to, designers. Like, marketing, this header is just completely vast now. It's a great point when you think about selling into marketing. That CMO, if you're selling analytics software, who's not an analyst by nature, that might not be a great entry point. You really need to think about that through that lens. That's a really, really great point. So the other thing that you mentioned to me was the idea that there's so much pace happening and there's macro pressures now, especially as we're starting to see a shift in the market. It seems to me that making their life easier would somehow be a door opener. Can you think of anything offhand that would make someone's life easier, that would make them think, oh, I should take that call?
Yeah. I think it really depends again on what we're selling, right? And I'm going to go back to what you just mentioned is that marketing has changed so much. We're not living in the days of Mad Men, to reference the TV show, kind of marketing anymore, right? And while the days of, hey, 50% of my marketing works, but I just don't know which 50%, while that's still relatively true, it's far less true every day that goes by these days because of what's available and out there. And so, I think there are sort of like two main things that I think we can sell on in the marketing arena. And I think it really depends on how differentiated you are in your space. And so if we think about something like like creative and copy services, that is increasingly feeling very commoditized. And so, in a lot of the buyers in that space, they can't discern, good from bad either, which I imagine is very, very frustrating for the folks that are true craftspeople in that space, mm-hmm. that are very good at it, that can discern that. But that increasingly feels commoditized. And so, oftentimes your point of differentiation there is service, right? It's hey, we don't screw up very often when we write your copy. We have a process in place, in talking through like, hey, although we're super creative, we have this great process. It's very procedural. We go through it. There are all these checkpoints, and this is how we make sure we deliver a great product and service to you. We have SLAs. Here's what they look like, right? Because that alleviates burden for the client.
Instills confidence.
And it builds confidence. And so often I've seen great creative agencies in my career that continuously goof up in copy, like they'll have a spelling error, a punctuation error, and I've seen very senior level executives become outstandingly frustrated with what should be a small, minuscule detail that they should be able to catch. And I've seen some of those agencies get fired and replaced by agencies that don't have the same chops, but they deliver consistently, right? Now, I think if we take it the other end, we go to a place where we're really, really differentiated. It's really tough for the CMO to survive and stay on the island on great creative and great copy, because you can't attribute much to it, right? There's a swirl of stuff going on out there, and it's really hard to kind of peel that and pick it apart and figure out what's going on. But if you have something that can show direct results in a very, very clear and tangible way, that's what that CMO brings into their C-suite meetings and with their peers and into the boardroom. It's those kinds of activities. And then it's like, oh, and by the way, these great results, here's how they come to life. Let me show you some examples. And that's when the creative and copy gets revealed. And, it's really window dressing. It's really kind of lipstick. But if the performance isn't there, nobody cares about any of that, right?
What are some of those results that you think that they should be bringing up to the executive level? Because I've seen executives gloss over with opens and clicks and window dressing type of metrics. What types of things should marketing leaders be bringing to the rest of their peers?
What they care about is just ringing the bell. All of the things that get measured outside of simply ringing the bell are all sort of like, precursors. They're almost symptoms to ringing the bell. Oh, and by the way, like, we did this many impressions. We had these campaigns. We bought a national TV ad, and we think we got this many impressions or clicks or opens or on-site content engagement that maybe is feeding into your CDP so you can understand what's really going on. Those are all sort of like precursors to real revenue, to real sales. And what they care about, at the end of the day, is ringing the bell. Then it's a question of, okay, how did we get here? Okay, how do we now optimize that or improve that in an iterative way so we can ring the bell more than we already are? That's really what they care about. Now, when we think about selling to them, we think about their chaotic world and the amount of burden, cognitive burden that's placed on them on a day-to-day basis. I think it's critical that the number one, that like the burden of proof is really on the salesperson, but it's also critical. I think there's a burden placed on the salesperson to make it as simple as possible. They don't have the brain space to try to sort through something very complex. So sometimes very simple things. Even if it comes down to creating something along the lines of, hey, this is the ROI that we normally see, and just converting that to like a dollar basis ROI to say, hey, our clients, without us, they spend $1 and they get $1.60 back. With us, they spend $1, they get $1.92. Very, very simple, easy to understand. They can walk around and talk about that all day, and everybody around them can understand it in a tiny brief moment and lock it in and remember it. That I think is really powerful.
You're touching on the subject of sales and marketing alignment, which certainly is not a new topic or one that has maybe even been solved in the past several decades. But what do you see happening? Are sales and marketing teams getting better at working together, or do we still have the same chasm that was there a decade or two ago?
I don't think they're getting any better at all.
Really?
I hate to be a pessimist. I actually think, and I think it stems from the way sales has changed. If we think about like the days of planes, trains, and automobiles, one of my favorite movies, we're very, very far from that world, right? And in that movie, John Candy and Steve Martin, they existed in a world of sales where there was information asymmetry, right? Where they held the information, and for the customers and the prospective buyers of what they had to offer to get that information so that they could form an opinion and make an educated decision, they had to talk to that salesperson, right? And I think right there you have, right, that's going to naturally establish kind of a communication gap and sort of a divide between sales and marketing. So you have, on one end, you have sort of like what's historically been this process of interruption. It's interrupt marketing. Hey, I know you're busy. I'm going to try to interrupt you and put my message in front of you over and over again and build familiarity. But they never really have an intimate, direct relationship or direct communication with the customer. On the other end, you've got these sales folks that are having direct communications with customers. That information, by and large, is not recorded. It's not shared back. There's no feedback loop to help make the whole sort of process and system work better, right? So there's a challenge there. But now fast forward to modern marketing. There is so much information out there and available for consumption, and some of it's great information. A lot of it's poor advice. There's a lot of poor advice out there as well, because anybody can go out there and write that information. Anybody can go out there and share their opinions. it's kind of the beautiful thing of sort of the World Wide Web and social media and everything else as we know it. But we also, I think we all acknowledge that it comes with a danger, and that's the danger. That said, before a customer wants to even talk to a salesperson these days, a prospective customer doesn't want to go into a conversation uneducated. It doesn't feel good to them. They feel unprepared. They don't feel like they're on equal footing, and they want to look smart, I think, too, when they talk to the customer. I do believe that. Like, they have their own ego. I mean, they're humans, right? And so they're out there researching and finding all of this information and trying to form some opinions. So they'll typically go into that conversation with opinions, and they're a lot farther down that buying journey now than they ever were before. Now, with that, it's so now how does marketing influence that formation of opinions before the conversation with the salesperson ever happens? And then how do they inform the salesperson? By the way, that buyer has consumed all of this content and is likely in this kind of a state, and is showing us these sorts of indicators in terms of their sentiment, their affinity, or their propensity to do certain things as you go into this conversation. And there's a huge rift there now, right? And I think it's great. There's a huge opportunity, but it also presents this sort of friction around, when you're the salesperson, you're like, hey, marketing, what are you doing to support me? What are you doing to educate the prospective buyer in our direction before I talk to them, before I'm in a call with them, before I'm face to face, before I'm on the phone, before I send them an email, right? And so, the complexity, it's the complexity of the modern world that I think is continuing to sort of prolong and seat that inherent sort of nature and friction between sales and marketing.
It's really funny that you say that, because it's a little bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it? You said earlier when we were talking that the creative side is almost the window dressing to the results. But then now you're saying how are we educating our buyer? How are we getting their attention and, taking their sentiment and moving it in our favor? A lot of times the creative, the branding, and those things are the impetus for that, to grab people's attention and move them into your stratosphere. I always use this example on this show, but I think of Drift every single time. You're familiar with Drift, the conversational intelligence bot. Well, there are lots of chat bots out there, but in our space, nobody talks about anything but Drift. They've done such a great job of branding conversational marketing or conversational intelligence that people think it's literally the only game in town. Now, as a seller, that gives you a lot of power when you're talking to someone. Oh, I'm with Drift. Oh, okay, great. I know who that is. One, that's a huge win if you're doing some sort of outbound calling or conversation. Two, there's instant credibility built into the fact that they're synonymous with being the market leader. And then three, it makes your life easier, right? So I think it is interesting that there's this side of the business that we say is kind of the window dressing, the creative and the branding and things like that. But I think it has a tremendous impact on sales that, if you think about sales and marketing alignment, it's a bigger piece of it than you might even imagine. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a huge deal. But I think it comes with a couple of things that you have to do well. When we think about, if we just think for a second about the kind of this sort of difference historically between B2B and B2C marketing, and although they're converging at a very rapid rate, and there's becoming little difference between them, and I think more and more often everybody's acknowledging that these are the same buyers, right? So the buyer of the Starbucks is the same buyer of the software. She just got her Starbucks on the way to the office before she signed the agreement to buy the software, right? It's the same person. That said, historically, marketers to consumers have done a really great job of tapping into human emotion, in tapping into human experiences that tend to be common amongst us as humans, or amongst certain segments, I'll call it, of humans, right? And that stuff, when you mix that together, you have this thing, they call it schema, and it's quite literally like a script in your mind that they can fire. And so, that's what's happening. Like when you see a Cheerios commercial, for example, right? And you see it's all about like heart health and longevity and vitality. And you'll typically see like a peppery, gray-haired grandfather hanging out with like his adorable, 4-year-old granddaughter, and they're having Cheerios together. And I mean, they're tugging at your heartstrings. That's what it feels like. They're firing schema in your mind. They've created very emotional hooks and messaging to put in front of you, and it builds their brand and it lasts. Like, look at how easily I just recalled that commercial. And I imagine you hearing me just explain at a high level how that commercial works. You're like, oh yeah, totally. I know those commercials and I know how they feel. That's how powerful that is. Now they put tons of impressions out there in the marketplace to really bring that to life. But at the core, the foundation is that, in B2B, a lot of companies, and I would say like most of them, struggle to make their positioning and their value proposition emotional. You have to have a human connection to bubble to the top or to be in that evoked set, right? That evoked set is like, hey, when I think about chatbots, one of the first things I think about is Drift. Drift is in my evoked set. They've earned their way in there. They've invested their way in there. They have positioned and differentiated their way into that evoked set. So, a lot of companies, land on websites that just say like, we make IT happen. We make IT happen, and that's not interesting to the average human. Now, there might be outliers out there that are like, yes, that's my jam. I'm going to go buy some of that. I'm going to buy as much of it as I can. But they're outliers. Those are few and far between. So again, I think to be successful in what we're talking about here, to get in that evoked set and to really kind of own it, you have to establish a really strong human connection. And so, in a good example of that out of tech, I would recall IBM from way back in the day. They used to have an advertising campaign that was effectively, nobody ever got fired for buying blue. And they're blue. Blue is their brand, and they own that. And if you think about that, they're tapping into this. They're tapping into fear. They're tapping into uncertainty. They're tapping into people's motivation for self-protection and self-propagation within their organization. And they're saying, the least risky thing you can do in your career is to buy IBM. So I think that part of that craft has to be mastered. And I think to do that effectively, it is a quantitative and a qualitative exercise to really hone in on it. Not only qualitatively understanding how our buyers feel and all of that, but quantitatively understanding who exactly is our buyer, where are they, right? What do they look and feel like? What are their behaviors? Can we track those, et cetera? And then that leads into this next part where you can't market to everybody on the planet all at once. You'll go bankrupt in like 24 hours. And so you have to have some methodology for figuring out who do we market to and when, and how much, right? How much. So, understanding who is potentially entering a buying cycle now is so much more challenging, like in the world of like leaving a digital, fingerprint or sort of trail of like cookie crumbs, if you will, along the way. And there are methodologies and ways to figure that out and to find out, okay, who's potentially entering a buyer cycle, who's starting to go out there and sort of self-educate. And when we see those signals out in the marketplace, when we can pick up on them, we can concentrate more marketing, both marketing and I would argue also sales resources towards building familiarity, building that brand, establishing that emotional connection, and really positioning for differentiation with them right at the very beginning.
Awesome. Well, Mark, I think this has been a really powerful discussion. If I had, 3 takeaways that I would leave the listeners with when it comes to selling into marketing, right? This is a heavy burdened piece of the business that you're trying to sell into. They deal with an excruciatingly fast pace. It's a multivariate skill set type of environment. They're being measured on results in a way that they never have before. And they're dealing with some pretty heavy market shifts right now. The second thing is to really think about the type of marketer that you may be selling into. Are they quantitative, qualitative, or that rare hybrid of people that has both the left and right side of the brain? And finally, the last point that you just made, especially in B2B marketing, let's not just rely on logic in order to open those doors and make those connections. We really need to make an emotional appeal to folks. Mark, I want to thank you for joining the show. Where can our audience find you if should they want to talk to you further?
Yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm available on LinkedIn, so go ahead and look me up. It's Mark Goblirsch, Goblirsch.
Oh, that's easy to spell.
Yeah, right. Yeah, feel free to reach out, connect if you ever want to chat. I'm happy to spend some time with you. Yeah, and I look forward to it if you do reach out.
Awesome. Well, I'll have Mark's LinkedIn profile in the show notes for this. And if you like this conversation, please make sure that you leave us at least a 5-star review, if not some positive commentary, and let us know how great Mark was. Mark, thanks for joining the show. Until next time, this is Love Selling, Hate Sales.